Today I'm going to start a 3-week sequence on valuation. That is how to put a price on things that are not traded on the market. And obviously a lot of stuff that we care about in the environment is not traded on markets, and that is why this is important. But before I'm going to speak about the methods next week and the week after, I'm going to do two things today. I'm going to talk about what is value, and second, why on earth would you want to put a value on something that is not traded on the market? Why would you want to know the price of something that you can't buy? So those are the two aims of today. I'm going to start with the history of value. Now, the very first lecture had a good bit of history of environmental economics, which was sort of an adornment. This history that I'm going to do today is not an adornment. Actually, a great many people, including economists, do not understand what is value. And that actually has a very long tradition, and I think it helps to understand where value comes from in order to understand what it is. So that's the plan for today. This is where we are in the overall schedule of things. But first, the history of value. Patterson, I forget which Patterson, said rightly that theories of value have formed the theoretical core of every major school of economic thought, both historically, but also some of the heterodox schools of economics, particularly ecological economics, has a very different view on what is value than does environmental economics, or what some people wrongly call neoclassical economics. There's nothing neoclassical about the economics that I'm teaching you or that you are taught here, right? Neoclassical economics died in 1936 or 37. And the history of value actually goes back to this guy here, Aristotle. And Aristotle distinguished between the value in use and the value in exchange. And the value in exchange is if you want to buy a goat, how much do you pay for it on the market, right? That is fairly simple, fairly trivial. Aristotle had no interest whatsoever in the value in exchange. He just noted that there is such a thing, there is a price for things. But he was much more interested in the value in use. And he was actually the first to phrase the so-called paradox of water and diamonds. You need to think back in ancient Greek times, where diamonds did not serve any purpose. They were pretty, but that's it. You could not do anything with them that could be seen as remotely useful. There are some women who will tell you that they will die or that they can't live without their diamonds, but that is not true. They're perfectly able to survive without diamonds. But even though diamonds are completely useless, or they were useless back then, right now we have all sorts of industrial applications because diamond is also the hardest substance known to humans, so it's very good for drilling and stuff, but back then diamonds were completely useless, yet the price of them was very, very high, whereas water, and thinking back to ancient Greek times, was free. You could just go to the stream and get you some water and drink it for free, or you could go to the well and get your water for free. So it was essentially without price, yet you cannot survive for more than 2 days without water. So water is essential. Its value in use is astronomically high, but its price is very low. Whereas diamonds, it's the exact opposite. Actually, it's not useful at all, whereas the price of diamonds is very high. And Aristotle and a great many other people wondered, how could this be? And they came up with all sorts of solutions. None of them satisfactory, and we have to wait until 1870 to find a satisfactory solution to this paradox. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, essentially rephrased the paradox of water and diamonds, and also had great difficulty solving it. Now, the problem that Aristotle had is that he was trying to understand value in use and what it was like. And it wasn't, as I said, just Aristotle, all through medieval times, all the way up into the Enlightenment. As I said, Adam Smith struggled with the same question. These people were not really interested in the price of things. They were interested in the value of things. And they completely understood that you can go to the market and pay something for it, and that was driven by demand and supply. But they were just not particularly interested in understanding how markets work and how prices are formed. And they were also not particularly interested in how that relates to the value of things, because they thought value and price are separate. And Aristotle had a solution. And Aristotle argued that the value in use is what it should be worth. That we should be able to reason from philosophical reasons, based on moral principles, based on ethical reasoning. We could figure out what something was worth or would be worth. And essentially what Aristotle argued is that there is an intrinsic value to everything, intrinsic value in use to everything, and we could use first principles to argue what that value would be. And essentially he said that us philosophers are best equipped to determine value. Saint Augustine, who lived about 800 years later, steeped in Greek philosophy, agreed and disagreed. Augustine, recently converted to Christianity, argued that the value of something is not so much what philosophers think something is worth, but the value of something is what God thinks it's worth. And other than that, it is basically the same approach. And then, of course, philosophers, because we cannot know the mind of God, we need priests and theologians to interpret that for us. So the philosophers in Aristotle's day were replaced by priests and bishops and what have you, and they would say what something is worth. A brief interlude. If you downloaded the slides yesterday, you would find a different picture of St. Augustine, where he looked very European, an older picture, but where he looked fairly European. Augustine was, of course, from what is now Algeria. And he's probably from Berber descent. And in this picture, which is also very old, his skin is much darker than most Europeans have predicted him through the ages, and that is probably appropriate. So that is what Augustine said, and why do I list this guy? Because he was very, very influential in the way European thought about these matters, and a whole lot of other matters was shaped. And if you go back, if you go forward another 800 years in time, Thomas Aquinas also wrote about what is value. And after a very deep thought and a very long period of reflection and an enormous amount of text, essentially he concluded that Augustine was right. And what you see is in that 800-year period, the sort of prevailing thought was still that the value in use is something intrinsic and it's God-given. And that is what it is. And it is our job as humans to detect the mind of God, right? So that is what people thought value was, essentially from ancient Greek times all the way up to the end of the Middle Ages. In the early modern period, William Petty, not Tom Petty, came along. I don't think there's a relation between the two. And he argued that labor is the father and active principle of wealth, as lands are the mother. So Petty actually began to deviate from this notion that it's God or morals that set value. And he actually argued, no, it is the factors of production that determine value. This is the early modern period, so capital wasn't very deep. So he thought it's land and labor are the two main things. Machinery did not really occur to him because it was not particularly important in his time. Now that was a bit of an historical aberration because not too long after the French School of Economics, the first fully formed School of Economics before the classical economists, and you know them from the tableau économique, right? The first input-output model, or what we could call an input-output model of how things flow through the economy. That is what perhaps they are best known for. But this school of thought, the physiocrats, also had a theory of value. And whereas Petty said it's land and labor, the Canet said no, it's land. And his reasoning actually goes back to Augustine's days. What Canet argued was that the laws of nature are God-given because God created the universe, right? And therefore the way to know the mind of God is through studying the laws of nature, right? Is what his argument was. And humans are most in contact with nature through agriculture. And therefore, crops and croplands are valuable. And all the other economic activity, such as processing foodstuff or trading food, that is all parasitic activity. But the true value comes from agriculture. Because in agriculture, you're closest to God, right? So on the one hand, he sort of like steps away from Augustine, that it's all about God, but then it is at one remove from the same source. Now that was his argument, right? And I realize that for a largely secular audience, these are very strange arguments, but that is what they did. Perhaps more easy to understand why he argued this was that Canet was, of course, landed gentry. You had to be landed gentry at the time in order to be able to study, right? And he was, as a medical doctor, in the service of the French court, right? Which is all about land ownership. So in a way, this was a very self-serving type of argument that us landowners, we add value, but you merchants and industrialists, it was mostly merchants at the time, fewer industrialists, do not add value, right? You're just parasites on the system. That was his argument. Adam Smith, sort of the father of classical economics and economics, all of economics, took the other side of Patty's remark and said it's all about labor. And this is a direct quote from The Wealth of Nations. If among a nation of hunters, for example, it usually costs twice the labor to kill a beaver, which it does to kill a deer, one beaver should naturally exchange for or be worth 2 deer, right? Where he essentially says the value of something is the amount of labor you put in. And he also argues that is what the price should be, right? And this is the so-called labor theory of value. Again, Smith was a child of his time, just like Kenney was. This was at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And this was in Scotland and England, where really it was labor was sort of the factor of production that determined the economy, right? It was the start of the Industrial Revolution, as I said. And agriculture was just not as important, and England already at that time was importing a lot of food, right, from France and other places. So that is what Adam Smith did. He did not really write a whole lot about the labor theory of value. That was really David Ricardo. And we'll meet, you've met David Ricardo in international trade, right? If you're going to do climate, we'll meet Ricardo again. But Ricardo also worked a lot what Smith actually meant, that it's the embedded labor in something that determines its true value. So Ricardo worked a lot on that, and then Marx, which you know from a different context, perfected, if you can call it that way, the labor theory of value, right? Ibn Khaldun is here as well, long before Smith and Ricardo and Marx wrote this. Ibn Khaldun wrote the same thing, or something very similar, but he did so in Arabic, right? And nobody in Europe was aware that basically Khaldun had worked out the same value system, the same theory of value, long before Europeans got there. So that's the labor theory of value. And there's one more theory of value, and that goes to a guy I mentioned in the first week, and some of his followers. Georgescu, Rögen, Costanza, and Odum have argued that the true worth of something is how much energy is contained in it. That it's not the amount of land that is contained in something or the amount of labor that is contained in something. No, it is the amount of energy that is contained in something that determines its true value. This is a very small theory nowadays. I mean, Costanza and Odum are still alive, but they haven't convinced a whole lot of people that they are right about this. It's not entirely true. There's people in econophysics, that is physicists doing economics, who sometimes adhere to this, but you would find very little of this in economic departments. That is less true for the theories of Bill Rees and, no, I don't know Wakkenagel's first name. How can I forget that? Anyway, they argue, like the physiocrats, way back when in French history, that really the true value of something is the amount of land that is converted, that is contained in something. And this is extremely popular among ecological economists, and particularly among non-economists, and particularly among the environmentalists, among the non-economists. And you will hear shortly, yeah, So in 2018, Earth Overshoot Day was May 8th, and it's probably a little bit earlier now. From sort of this week onwards, you will read in The Guardian that certain countries have overshot their allowance of space, that they have used more space than the country actually has. And we'll come back to this in week 11. But the land theory of value is alive and kicking, not just in 2018, but also in 2023. So throughout history and up to today, there are people who have argued, and most people believed them, that the value in use of something is set by ethical considerations, religious considerations, land, labor, or energy. That is, there is an absolute yardstick that determines something's worth. Right? Now that has implications, and one implication is that if the price or the value in exchange deviates from the value in use, then that is because the market is rotten or the market is immoral. There is something wrong with our prices. If what you pay for something is more than what it's worth, or if you pay for something is less than what it's truly worth, right? The implication is an immediate condemnation of the market. And you can see why some of these theories continue to be popular, because it allows you to shake a stick at capitalism, right, and at free markets. The classical economists turn this upside down, right? Because they argued two things. One, they argued that the invisible hand, the free market, would give a Pareto optimum. And they also thought that a Pareto optimum is a true optimum, and we talked about that. And they also thought that market prices reflect the labor content, which is as they should. So classical economists took the opposite view of basically everybody else, arguing not that the market does things wrong, but that the market does things right, that the market is moral. The market isn't just as it is, but it's actually the way God intended it to be, right? Now, this is what economists thought until 1870, and this is what a lot of non-economists think until 2023, right? And even though basically everybody knows the atom model of Bohr, right, which is actually slightly younger than the economic theory of value, hardly anybody outside of economics understands the economic theory of value. And that was shaped in and during the neoclassical revolution. And the three neoclassical revolutionaries are Jevons, Menger, and Walras. And essentially what they argued was that value is relative. Value measures demand relative to supply, and it's based on production and consumption. And essentially the price of something, and I talked about it the week before last, the price of something is the marginal utility, or the relative price of something is the relative marginal utility. That is what something is worth. So this notion that the marginal rate of substitution should equal the price ratio essentially says that the value in exchange, that is the prices, equals the value in use at the margin, right? That is essentially what the neoclassical revolution established. And this is a revolution, right? There is no longer an absolute standard of value, but everything becomes relative, right? Essentially what the neoclassical revolution did was it replaced God and morals by utility functions. It also replaced the production side of things, the labor value, labor theory of value, and the land theory of value, and the energy theory of value, replaced it with a consumption theory of value. That it's utility functions that matter. And something very important, as economists, we don't talk about utility functions. Not in the sense that we tell people what their utility should be and what they should care about. We take them as given. And that then immediately implies that the market is not moral and it's not immoral, but it's amoral. There's no value judgments passed. The market does what it does. Utility functions are what they are. And we just study them and take them as given, right? So a completely different stance on the market as well, also completely different from the classical view of value, right? Now, non-economists typically confuse classical economics with neoclassical economics and don't understand that the word neo actually has a real meaning there, nor do people outside the discipline understand that neoclassical economics is long dead and what we do now has actually very little to do with neoclassical economics anymore, except for this bit. This is something that we retain. The implication of all this is that value now depends on context. There is no longer an absolute God-given or labor-given or Allah-given or whatever you believe in. No longer an absolute yardstick, but everything is relative, right? Now, I think Darius the Great understood this. And Darius the Great, the King of Kings, is long dead, right? Does anybody know Middle Eastern history well enough? This is 7, 8 centuries before Christ? Something like that? You think that's right. Darius the Great at one point asked a bunch of Greeks how much they would be willing to accept as compensation if they would be told to eat their dead rather than burn them. And the Greeks answered, no way, you can't give us any sort of money for us to eat our deceased, right? Because we bury them or we cremate them, but we definitely would not ever eat our deceased grandfather. And Darius then turned around and asked a group, an Indian tribe, representatives of a tribe in India, the same or the alternative question: how much should I give you as compensation if you are not allowed to eat your dead, but you instead have to burn them? And they gave the exact same answer, that no way you can give us any amount of gold that will compensate us for not being allowed to eat our dead, because that is the way we honor our ancestors, right? And the thought to them of cremating human bodies was abhorrent, right? So value depends on context, right? And it depends on who you talk to and what is being valued. And that has all sorts of implications. Obviously, value depends on supply and demand, which immediately explains why water is cheap, right? Because it is abundant. And even though it is immensely valuable, there is more water than you could possibly drink, at least in olden times, and it was all pretty clean. So yeah, the value in exchange is pretty low, essentially zero, even though the value in use is very, very high. And that is because we're not interested so much in the value in use, but we're interested in the marginal value in use, right? If water is abundant, then a little bit extra or a little bit less, you're not prepared to pay anything for it because your demand is satiated, right? And similarly, diamonds, even though they're pretty useless, they're also very scarce. And diamonds are useful in the sense that you can show off to other people how rich you are. And you can use that to demonstrate your status in society. And that is something that people are prepared to pay a lot for, right? Also implies that things that are uncertain are worth less than things that are certain. You're not sure about the payoff of something, then you're willing to pay less for it. And of course, if something is truly unique, then supply is very much constrained, and it's worth much more than something that is abundant, right? At the moment, everybody's going on about the paintings of Vermeer, right? Who was a great painter, but also a very slow painter. So he painted only 37 pictures in his life, and that means that each of those 37 great paintings is unique, and there's very little substitution there. So these things are extremely expensive, much more expensive than contemporary painters who were just as good as painters, but worked at a much faster clip, and therefore there is a greater supply of their paintings, right? So that is value, the price of something, the value in exchange is the marginal value in use. And if you can retain that until your retirement, I would be very happy. Now, how do we measure value? There's essentially four values of that, and they go back to the gentleman you see here, Sir John Hicks, who won the Nobel Prize in 1972, if I'm not mistaken. And Hicks defined two measures of valuation, two basic measures of valuation, known as the equivalent and compensating variation, and they are typically referred to as the Hicksian equivalent and the Hicksian compensating variation. That is a bit of a mouthful. And it's not particularly clear what is an equivalent variation, right? You look at those words and you think, like, yeah, what would that possibly mean? And they're better known, and that is how I will talk about them, as willingness to pay and willingness to accept compensation. So the willingness to pay is how much you are willing to give up, what portion of your income you are willing to give up in order to acquire something. And this is a supermarket situation. You walk into the supermarket, you're interested in cornflakes, and you're wondering, what part of my income am I willing to give up for a box of cornflakes? Now, I never buy cornflakes, so I really would not know. But probably it is 2 or 3 pounds, right, that you would pay for. Nobody's laughing at me, so I'm probably not too far off. That is how much you would be willing to pay for a box of cornflakes, right? Probably a smaller box. So that is the equivalent variation, your willingness to pay. You don't have it, and you want it, right? And you're willing to pay something for it. The willingness to accept compensation is the opposite scenario, where you have something and then you lose it, and then somebody offers to compensate you for your loss. So the Hicksian equivalent variation is your maximum willingness to pay to acquire something, and the Hicksian compensating variation is the minimum you would be willing to accept as compensation for losing something, right? So that is, you just bought your box of cornflakes, you walk out of the supermarket and somebody knocks it out of your hand and the box breaks and it's all over the pavement, right? How much would you demand in compensation for this box of cornflakes that you have just lost, right? So those are the two basic measures of value. And of course, willingness to pay can also be a willingness to pay to avoid a sure loss. Willingness to accept compensation could also be compensation in order to forego a sure gain, right? So you can turn this around and then you have 4 measures, but that is not particularly important. So let's talk about not measurement of value, but types of value. And there's 2 ways of looking at this. And we're looking here at a stream in a forest. And the question is, why do we care, right? And I'm going to offer you 2 taxonomies of why do we care. And the first is popular among ecologists and environmentalists in particular. And that is that we look at the services provided by the environment. And they come in 4 broad groups. The first is provisioning. That is, we get water, right? And that is essential for our lives. We get food, which is almost as essential, right? You can go for 2 days without water and 2 weeks without food. We can get wood from the forest to burn, and so on and so forth, right? So direct provisioning of our needs, right? Another set of services is regulation. One thing that a forest does is that it stores CO2. So it helps to regulate the climate. Another thing that a forest does is that it's darker than grassland, so it regulates the albedo. So that is the amount of sunlight that is reflected. So that also regulates the climate. One thing that trees do is that they filter out a lot of air pollution. So if you have a road with trees on the side, you have less air pollution than if you have the same road and the same traffic without those trees, because trees essentially filter out the air pollutants. Similarly, but trees don't do that, what water bodies do, is that they filter out a lot of the environmental contaminants that we dump into the water. A lot of that is filtered out in biological and chemical and sometimes physical processes, right? So though that's not a direct provision like the water that we drink or the food that we eat, but it is important to us, right? There is also a set of cultural services, and that is that we would like to go for a walk in the forest, that we would like to look and think about forests, sort of aesthetical and inspirational values. We can use it to teach our children about the birds and the bees and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of sort of intangible consumption from nature as well. And then there is what is known as supporting services. That, yeah, if you have a good forest, then it also builds up soil, which can be later used to grow plants. It cycles nutrients, and there's primary production of the plant material, and of course also the production of oxygen, right? And all those things are important to us as well. So that is one way of looking at why do we care about nature? Because nature actually does a lot of things for us, right? Some immediately obvious, go for a walk in the forest, and some a little bit more subtle. That is where your oxygen comes from, or that is where your pollution goes. And this is a popular way of looking at environmental valuation among environmentalists. Economists tend to look at a different classification, not because we disagree, but we just do. And that is to look at, economists tend to define total economic value as follows, looking at it through a consumption perspective. So there's use values, there's option values, and there's non-use values, right? And then those use values fall into direct and indirect use values, and the direct use values fall into consumptive and non-consumptive values. And then option values fall apart into option values and quasi-option values, and non-use values fall apart into the use of others, as well as pure existence, and then other use falls apart into bequest and altruism. Now, this all sounds very abstract, so let's return to our forest and see what I mean by all these things, right? So let's look at a rainforest, and what would consumption, direct consumption use value be? Or direct use value in a consumptive or extractive sense. Now, that would be the timber you get out, right? Or the fuel wood that you get out, or the nuts that you would get out, or the rubber, right? It is extractive because once you have chopped down the tree, it is not there anymore, right? So the way to use the forest is by partly destroying it, right? So that is why it's consumptive use, and you directly use it, right? Non-consumptive use of the rainforest, if you just go in there to enjoy yourself without, perhaps you break a twig here and there, but that's it. You don't go around and destroy the forest. You just go and enjoy yourself, and you try to be as little a nuisance as possible. So that would be, it's direct use, right? You directly derive utility from this activity, otherwise why would you do it? But you do so without harming and hopefully without changing the system too much. Indirect use values are such things as the storage of CO2 in the trees, where the value to us comes from less climate change, right? Or if you have a hilly landscape and it's forested and it rains, then the rain is absorbed by the forest. And you don't have much of a flood problem in the valley. If those hills are denuded, that is, you cut down all the trees, then the water just runs off very quickly. It's no longer a sponge, but it just releases the water as soon as it falls. And you do have a flood problem in the valley, right? So watershed protection is another indirect use of the forest. And similarly, if you have heavy rainfall in a denuded hill, then all your topsoil just washes down, right? And you have landslides and all that stuff. So that is indirect use of the forest, right? And I hope you agree that these things are useful to us. Option values are simple, right? Option values are use values in the future. So non-consumptive direct use is people go and have fun in the forest. An option value is you maintain the forest so that maybe next year people will come and enjoy themselves in the forest, right? But of course it's an option value because it's not necessary that they will come, right? It's not guaranteed. So that is relatively straightforward. Quasi-option values people always get terribly confused about. The difference between an option value and a quasi-option value is that an option value is not guaranteed, but it is sort of can be done with current technology and so on and so forth. Quasi-option value is about something we don't know, but it might be there. One thing that people have long hoped for is that somewhere in the rainforest there lurks a cure for cancer. There is some tree that we haven't fully understood yet, and its bark has these qualities that it would cure cancer, right? Did I say cancer rate? We don't recall. Doesn't matter, right? And then if that is true, chopping down the rainforest would of course kill all those trees before we could make use of this particular medicine, and that would be a terrible loss. But it's a quasi-option value because we don't know that it will be there, right? Of course, we have examples in the past, right, where quinine, for instance, I'm not sure that I pronounced that correctly, comes from the bark of a tree in a rainforest, and it helps greatly against malaria, right? Or used to before the bugs got resistance, right? So this is not unheard of. But of course, those things that we know that happened in the past, that we know of, that's no longer a quasi-option value, but there may be more medicine lurking in the forest, right? Okay, let's look at non-use values. And the first of the non-use values is actually a use value, but it's a use value by somebody else. So bequest is, I don't care so much about the forest, but I do care that my kids care about the forest. And I would like to leave the forest as it is so that in the future my children and grandchildren can go enjoy it, right? So there is a bequest value. We hope to preserve things for the next generation. Altruism is, I don't care about the forest, but my brother does. And therefore, I think the forest should be preserved, right? My brother doesn't care about these things, but as a hypothetical example, right? It may be that you don't care, but people you care about do. And you care about things indirectly in that way. And then the one that economists have really great difficulty getting their heads around is existence value. And it has been shown that these things are real. So in the week after next, I will talk about contingent valuation studies, where essentially you interview people, how much are you willing to pay to preserve a flock of sheep somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. And people like sheep, particularly when they're woolly and have long horns and stuff, right? And they are willing to pay something to help preserve this particular species, or perhaps it's a subspecies of sheep. And people are prepared to contribute to what they consider to be a good cause. And if you ask the question like that, there will be the longhorn sheep will stay in the Rockies, and you can go visit them and look at them from a distance because they have these long horns, right? So you don't want to come too close because they're wild sheep and they can be pretty aggressive if you come too close to their young. But from a distance you can see them, and wouldn't that be great? And people are prepared to contribute to preserving longhorn sheep if that is the scenario that you sketch in your survey. But if in the same survey you sort of the other half of the people you interview, you sort of say, we're going to close this park And we're pretty sure that if we close the park and there will be no disturbance, then the longhorn sheep will be fine and will multiply and thrive. You can't go and see them. And in fact, it's not just that you can't go and see them, but we also won't let in any camera teams to make a documentary with David Attenborough talking about longhorn sheep. So really you have no way of knowing that they're fine. You just have to take our word for it. Are you still willing to pay for the preservation of the longhorn sheep? And lo and behold, the answer is yes. People do attach value to the knowledge of something existing without ever directly or indirectly experiencing this, or for that matter, for their children or grandchildren to experience this. That is a pure existence value. We care about things just because they are there. Now, other people have interpreted these pure existence values in terms of stewardship, like going back to God, and God has given us planet Earth to look after, right? It's a very Christian notion, stewardship. But of course, in other religions, there's also reasons why you would want to care about nature because of some religious duty or because of some ethical consideration. I think that is the wrong interpretation, because this then again becomes an absolute value, right? Rather than a relative demand and supply sort of thing. So I think that is the wrong way of looking at existence values, but definitely people have done so. So that is the sort of in economic circles prevalent classification of value. After the break, I'm going to talk about, by now you know what is value. I'm going to talk about why you would want to put a price on things in the first place. Okay, we're going to break for 10 minutes, reconvene at 5 past. I talked about what is value, and types of value, and measures of value as well. But I haven't talked about the question why. Well, there's a whole range of reasons why you would want to know the price of stuff, particularly of environmental damage. You may want to compare the impacts of environmental damage to the impact of emission reduction, and then you need to have something on a comparable basis, right? We talked briefly about it last week. You may want to impose a PGU tax. Taxes are imposed in money, right? And the PGU tax is equal to the marginal damage done by your emissions. So you will need to know that marginal damage in monetary terms. You may want to pay something for someone for environmental services, and payments are done in money, and you would not want to pay over the odds. You may want to extend the national accounts to include environmental impacts, and national accounts are also measured in dollars and pounds. Or you may want to compensate people for the environmental damage that is done to them. And if you want to do any of these things, then you have to resort to monetary valuation. When I showed you this quote by Robert Solow already, that you can protest that we're bean counters and that we want to know the price of something without knowing its value, but unfortunately that has to be done. I inherited this module from George, and George likes pretty pictures. And the point made here is that, we want to know the value of climate, we want to know the value of a mountain landscape or the value of a frog, or the value of a coral reef. But yeah, you can't buy these things on the market, right? So we have to use other ways of finding that value. And we talked about cost-benefit analysis last week, both in the lecture and the seminar. And what you need to do in cost-benefit analysis is compare the costs of something to its benefits. And we definitely do not want to restrict the attention to those things that are traded on markets, because essentially then what you say is I only look at the costs of something, and if I do not quantify the benefits, then there's nothing to compare it to. And essentially what you do is if you do not quantify the benefits and put them on an equal footing with the cost of something, then essentially what you're saying is that those benefits are worth nothing, right? So you would have to do that. And the question is how. One very simple way of showing the necessity of this is if we look at things that are measured on the real line, and that is shown here, and we want to compare A to B, then it's pretty clear that A is bigger than B, right? And if you believe that more is better, then we now also know that A is better than B, right? And if you believe that less is more, then B is better than A, right? But it's unambiguous. The relationship between A and B is clear, right? Now, if we work in 2 dimensions, then if we compare A and B, and we still believe that more is better, then it's pretty clear that A is greater than B, right? Because A is greater than B in 1 dimension and is also greater than B in the other dimension. So we can unambiguously say that A is greater than B, and if you believe that more is better, then A is better than B. But what now if we have C and D, right? Now it's clear that A is equal to D in 1 dimension, and A is greater than D in the other dimension. So A is greater and therefore better than D. And similarly, A is larger than C in 1 dimension, the same in the other dimension, so A is also greater than C. So that is pretty simple. We can do similar stories with B, right? B is worse than C and worse than D and definitely worse than A. But if we have to choose between C and D, we have a problem, right? You cannot say whether C is greater than D or D is greater than C. There is just no way of doing this. And that is, unfortunately, the way it is. And what you do in cost-benefit analysis or in monetary valuation is essentially we are no longer interested in X and Y, or Y and X, I always get that wrong. Instead, we take a linear combination of the 2 dimensions. We can normalize the price of one at 1, and then we have to have a price for the other at A. And then we add them up. And then we have, again, a comparison in a single dimension. We translate this 2-dimensional problem to a 1-dimensional problem, and then we can say whether C is greater or smaller than D, right? So if you want to, and that is what a cost-benefit analysis is about, if you want to say that this project is better than that project, or my policy proposal is better than your policy proposal, then you have to express everything in a single dimension, right? And that is the condition, right? The condition is that we express things in a single dimension. It's not necessarily the case that we express everything in monetary terms. We can translate everything into polar bear equivalents. As long as everything is expressed in polar bears, that is perfectly fine too. But it has to be one dimension. The reason that we pick money is, recall from your principles, money serves three functions, right? It is a means of exchange, it is a store of value, and it is a unit of account. And we are not expressing things in monetary terms in order to sell it. So we're not interested in a means of exchange. We also do not convert it into money and then put it under a mattress or in the bank, right? So we're also not using it as a store of value. But we are using money here as a unit of account, right? And that is something that non-economists also find very confusing. They do not realize that money has these three functions, and the reason that we express things in money, the reason that we value environmental goods and services in monetary terms is because money is a unit of account, right? So that is what we're doing. Now, last week I also very briefly touched on multi-criteria analysis. So there's two steps in multi-criteria analysis. One is that you exclude the dominated alternatives. So if you have to choose between A, B, C, and D, then B is better, B is worse than anything else, so don't consider that any longer, right? And also we saw that A is actually better than everything, so that is what you pick, right? But if A is not an option and your multi-criteria analysis is about choosing between project B, C, and D, then in step one of your multi-criteria analysis, you say, well, B is out of the question, right? Because it's worse than the two others, so discard it. This is not what we're going to do. And then in order to choose between C and D, multi-criteria analysis also introduces some W, that is some unidimensional measure. And instead of having a linear combination of X and Y, you use some function of X and Y. That is what multi-criteria analysis does. And essentially cost-benefit analysis is a linear approximation of multi-criteria analysis. Question is, of course, where do you get that function from, right? Just as in cost-benefit analysis, the question is, where do you get your A, right? Because that is absolutely crucial. And we'll be talking about that for 2 weeks. Where do you get your A? With multi-criteria analysis, the question is, of course, where did you get your F, right? Anyway. So, what can you do, right? Let's look at a concrete example. Tax and regulation is one reason why you would want to value things. If you look at quarrying, and you see an example here, there's all sorts of externalities to the environment. There's noise, there's dust, there's vibration, there's water contamination. And if you've traveled around Sussex, there is visual issues, like these quarries look just terrible when they're active quarries. Actually, later on, they become beautiful lakes, right? There's issues with heritage, depending on what you're quarrying, and plants and animals are not too keen on all this stuff either. So if you want to sort of find the efficient level of quarrying, we need to quantify those externalities, we need to monetize them, and then we need to impose a tax on these things. Now, the UK government is actually pretty keen on these sort of things and has been for a long time. And the Department of, I believe, Energy, Transport and the Regions, as it was called then, commissioned studies to essentially estimate these externalities. And what they found was that the willingness to pay for people to reduce sand and gravel extraction amounted to some £2 per ton, whereas the willingness to accept compensation for more of the stuff amounted to around £9 per ton. And people were less worried about other things such as limestone and everything. And what the government did was slap a tax on. And now, if you are in this business, which you are not, but if you were in this business and you want to dig out a ton of sand or gravel or limestone or whatever slate, you pay the government £2 for every ton that you quarry, right? And this is to reduce mining, to reduce quarrying, and to internalize the externality. So this is real, right? This is not some hypothetical example. This is what the UK government does. And there's actually, even though this never makes headlines, there is this whole long list of environmental levies in this country. One of it that I was involved in is the landfill tax. If you have a landfill and you emit methane, then you pay for every ton of methane that you release into the atmosphere, and you pay according to a study that I published, I think in the early 90s, and they never changed it. But you also pay for the amount of toxic material that you release, the noise, and so on and so forth, right? I was not involved in that, but I was involved in the methane. Similarly, if you fly, and we are allowed to do that again, to go on holiday, then you're paying an air passenger duty, which is nominally the amount of CO is equivalent or proportional to the amount of CO2 that you emit on this particular flight, right? So yes, all these things are real and really there, and you're actually paying for this stuff every month, right? Because the landfill tax actually goes to your rent. It's your landlord who pays the landfill duty, but you pay the landlord, right? There's other uses of environmental valuation. This is the Deepwater Horizon. That's now 13 years ago, guys. God, you were 6, 7? So you don't recall this, or why it happened, right? Or how it can be that the guy responsible for this was made a lord, right? But some 13 years ago, on the 20th of April, almost 13 years ago, British Petroleum, after years of cutting corners, had a pretty serious accident in one of their oil platforms in the Mexican Gulf. Actually, the notes don't say how many people were killed. I think 17 people were killed in the fire, and 750 million liters of oil spilled into the Gulf and onto the coast of Louisiana in particular. The result is what you see here, a lot of dead fish, a lot of dead birds, a lot of, it's a pretty touristy coast, a lot of hotel owners going bankrupt, and so on and so forth. So you could wonder, like, how much should we have paid, or how much British Petroleum should have paid in order to minimize the chance of this, right? And for that, you need to know how much it is worth, right? For them to quantify this. Now, BP in the end paid fines worth tens of billions of dollars. And those fines were actually based on the loss of revenue to those hotel owners, the damage to those birds and those fish, birds that you saw, fish that you did not see. And all that was done using valuation techniques. So they could have done this ex ante and said, well, the chance of this happening is 1%. The fines that we will get are worth 30 billion. So we should be willing to pay a good few billions to make sure that it doesn't happen, right? Which they didn't. Similarly, you can try and stop, in this case, a bulldozer, I think, meant to take down trees, right? And one of the questions is, of course, how are you going to stop those bulldozers? And one way is to go stand in front of them, as one of your previous prime ministers said he would do with the Heathrow expansion, right, but never did. You can try and stop this through legislation and litigation, say, well, it's forbidden. That, of course, requires enforcement and so on and so forth. Does not necessarily happen. In a country like Brazil, there's a lot of illegal logging, right? Illegal logging is a much bigger problem in Brazil, a much bigger threat to the rainforest than legal logging. The same is true for the rainforest in West Africa. The same is true for the rainforest in Southeast Asia. The problem there is not so much that the laws are not all right, not so much that it's allowed to do these things. The problem is that these laws are not enforced, right? Either they're not enforced at all, or it's very easy to bribe the enforcers. So that is not really an option. Another thing that you can do is try and bribe them out of it, right? I am a bit lost with the sequence at the moment. I'm just going to finish that, right? And one scheme of doing so are the so-called payments for environmental services, where essentially what you do is you pay people not to damage the environment. And that may sound sort of immoral. That may sound, this is not really what we want to do. We don't want to reward the bad guys, right? But sometimes it's your only option. And essentially the problem with a lot of nature conservation is that the locals who cut down the trees, or the locals who shoot the elephants, don't have any other means of making money. And therefore, they cut down the trees or they shoot the elephants, because that is the quickest way to prosperity for them, right? And you may hate it that they do so, and presumably they don't like it either, because they're human just like you are. But they have no choice, or they have very little choice. So payments for environmental services essentially tries to turn this around and say, we're going to create an alternative livelihood. And the alternative livelihood depends on you preserving the environment. So instead of having poaching of elephants, we have ecotourism. And that may be more lucrative than shooting. And the same is true and probably easier for not deforesting. You pay people to keep the trees on the land. You pay them for every tree that is there. And then they have a reason not to cut it down. Provided, of course, that the payment that you give them is worth more than the wood in timber, right? And provided that the payment that you give them is worth more than converting the forest into pasture land, right? And there's lots of these schemes going on, not just in Brazil and not just in Congo and not just in Indonesia, but also here in the English countryside, right? Where farmers are paid to not just to keep paths open for you to go wander around if you're so inclined, but also farmers are being paid to preserve hedgerows, because there's a lot of biodiversity, a lot of insects, a lot of birds in those hedgerows. And increasingly farmers are being paid not so much for, no. There's one payment to English farmers that they get if they don't cut the sides of their fields until the 1st of July. And the reason for this is so that ground nesting birds have a chance to raise their young, right? And then once the young are flown, which is sort of around the end of June, you can cut the grass, right? That is the idea. And at the moment, this is a payment just not to cut the grass. It's a bit clumsy, and people are now sort of switching experimentally in this country, more structurally in countries near to us, where they actually go around and count the number of nests. And you get paid for every egg that is found on your land, right? Or every young bird that is born on your land. And then you have a reason to conserve, right? And of course, the reason that farmers want to cut the grass is A, visibility, but more importantly, all the seeds that come and blow into your actual crop, right? You need to do a lot more weeding if you have a fully grown meadow next to it, right? So all that is currently ongoing, but yeah, you need to know what is this bird worth, right? Because yeah, it's very easy to sort of like put a number on and sort of say, well, this would be enough to induce farmers, but then you may be paying too much or too little for that matter. I think that covers all the payments for environmental services. Now, I don't know why the sequence got mixed up. Returning to the oil, as I said, the Deepwater Horizon blew up, and that led to very substantial fines for British Petroleum. Now, long before you were born, in 1989, there was another major accident with the Exxon Valdez. This was in 1989, as I said, and this was in Alaska, where an oil tanker ran aground and basically spilled all its contents all over the Prince William Sound. And this was the very first time that monetary valuation was used in court, and it was used to determine how much damages should be paid. to some of the commercial parties involved, like the fisher folk that were out there. That was relatively easy, right? Because they could not fish anymore for a year or so. So that's just the average annual revenue, right, that they lost. That was simple enough. But the state of Alaska also litigated for the environmental damage that was done. Now, this was an enormous lawsuit. And if you follow this, if you watch telly with legal things, this was a very big lawsuit. Years and years and years and years with lots and lots of experts involved. And this was the very first time that monetary valuation of the environment was actually put to the test. It was used in anger. And anger is the right word. Some of the veterans of this, like Richard Carson, still start cursing when you mention the other side of these lawsuits. So there were two teams, two groups of economists who were pitted against each other. There were the environmental economists, Richard Carson among them. And then there was this bunch of two Nobel laureates. No, they had one Nobel laureate and one Nobel candidate on board from MIT who argued that environmental valuation is all nonsense, and we'll come back to that in 2 weeks. But in the end, the environmental economists won, and the total damages that were calculated for this were somewhere in the range of 3 to 9 billion, and I forget how much was awarded in the end. But Exxon did pay substantial fines for this. So, those are the reasons why you would want to evaluate things. I think I captured everything apart from this one. And it's all real, right? It's really used to set taxes. It's really used to set damages in court. And it's really used, and I'll talk about it in week 11, to adjust the measures of economic growth. At the moment, sort of the traditional measure of economic growth, which is the change in gross domestic product, is the change in total value added, right? So things that are not subject to an economic transaction are not included in the gross domestic product, and therefore it can be that you're growing at the expense of the environment, right? And these valuation methods are also used to come up with true measures of economic growth that doesn't just look at how much did we all earn, but also how much of those earnings came at the expense of environmental pollution, right? But we'll return to that in week 11.